for the benefit of the witnesses, since the members have heard this many times before, but in order to protect the hearing of the interpreters, please only use an approved earpiece, which is the black one here. If you have a gray one, it's not an approved type. Keep your earpiece a good distance from the microphone, like don't get up too close to the microphone with your earpiece on. If your earpiece is off, please put it face down on the coaster-like sticker that you see there on the desk. And yeah, so that's basically it. There's also a little card here probably in front of you that explains a little further some of the procedures we should keep in mind to protect the hearing of our wonderful interpreters who work so very hard to make sure we can all understand each other. Another housekeeping business this is for the members. It relates to. Oh yes, and please don't touch your microphone. Don't hit your microphone with your finger because that creates a pretty loud noise for the interpreters. But at the last meeting, we had the minister, and it turned out we had votes. We had many votes while the minister was there, and there was consent by many members, unanimous consent, that we would continue the meeting and just pause briefly for a minute or two every time there was a vote. And in fact, even the minister voted with us on his phone app. It worked very well. I was going to do that today because we were expecting 11 votes, and I didn't want to cancel the meeting. And all the parties agreed that we could proceed the same way, voting as we went along. There are no votes this afternoon, but apparently there could be a number of votes Tuesday. So I just would like the consent of the committee for this coming Tuesday, when the minister will appear again, that if there are votes, we do as we did last time. When there's a vote, we pause for a couple of minutes, we vote on our phones and keep going. That way we don't have to cancel meetings or prolong meetings. So I think I see that there's a consent around that, and I'll go with it. So perfect. So we have with us today in the first hour, we have basically 4 witness groups who will be speaking to us. Each witness group has 5 minutes for opening statements, and then we go to 2 rounds of questioning. We have with us Alpha Fix Capital. We have the managing director, Sébastien Réaume. We have the portfolio manager responsible for investment. It says partners, I guess. I think that's what it says. Simon Sénégal. Then from the Chambre de commerce du Canada, nous avons Jessica Brandon-Epp, directrice principale politique des services fiscaux et financiers. Nous avons Brian Detchou, directeur principal ressources naturelles environnementales.
Brian Detchou, responsible for natural resources.
We also have Mr. Terence Keeley from the Impact Evaluation Lab, and from the Insurance Bureau of Canada, Jason Clark, the National Director, and Rachel Berry, the Manager. So we will start with Alpha Fix Capital. I believe Mr. Réaume will probably begin. For 5 minutes. Thank you. I am the co-founder for Alpha Fix Capital, a file management company. We work out of Montreal, and we are
first green bond fund, and the main objective of that fund was really to facilitate the financing of projects which would have a positive impact in terms of the environment, such as renewable energy, public transportation, or green buildings. I'm very proud to say that we have financed since 2017 more than $10 billion of such projects. However, we have had very limited success in terms of helping decarbonize the energy infrastructure industry, which is the reason we're here today. And if we all together, Canada doesn't raise to this challenge, there's a good chance that part of this industry might appear to disappear. And when we look at the success we've had with our Green Bond Fund, we were here to express some ideas in terms of how we could recreate that success and help the oil and gas industry decarbonize to meet Canada's objectives. So I'm joined here with Simon Sénécal, who's going to walk you through some ideas in terms of what are the missing pieces that might be helpful to help decarbonize the energy infrastructure sector. Simon.
Bonjour, merci Sébastien.
Hello, thank you, Sébastien. We look at the net zero emission scenario of the International Emission Agency. They said that in 2050, 23% of energies will be fossil fuels. In Canada, 31% of decarbonization efforts must come from the oil and gas sector in order to reach our net zero emission goal in 2050. 16% from the electricity production, and we have to make an effort on that side too. I invite you to ask questions on electricity production as well. Here's what you must remember. The challenge ahead of us is huge. It's been a little while, but the government has already set out the steps for a transition. So there are requirements for emitters, and they are pretty strict, which is great. That's exactly what we want. We want to decarbonize the industry. There are also some guidelines for projects that companies can finance to decarbonize their projects. However, there isn't a good enough list of projects, and they're not strict enough. That would help us for the decarbonization strategy. So the emphasis here will be on decarbonization so that we don't, fall, get confused with a bunch of different definitions. And it's important for us to remain pragmatic. At AlphaFix, we have a list of exclusions. They exclude companies that are engaged in extractivist activities, and we also have a commitment. So the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. By 2030, we want 100% of our investments to be aligned with a decarbonization plan, aligned with science to respect the 1.5 degree Celsius climate change. So fossil fuels, whether it's extractivist companies, Enbridge, Suncor, just to name a couple. I'm not saying they're worse than the others, but there are efforts being made by all these companies, and they should all be sold by 2030 in our on our side if nothing changes. We are not the only ones who think like this. That is an important risk for the financial market in Canada, because just in case, everybody tries to leave at the same time. With regards to taxonomy, the taxonomy would be helpful for companies to understand what kind of company is aligned with these requirements, but it would help us as investors as well to see what kind of behavior certain companies should be engaging with as social citizens, or rather corporations. 23% of the companies involved are directly linked to fossil fuels, but they contribute to 84% of the carbon emissions. So you see our leverage in our market. We want to engage in a conversation with these companies in order to influence them. What we recommend is the implementation of a clear and strict taxonomy that would help fossil fuel companies to adopt a decarbonization or transition strategy that is based on science. We also would like to impose a minimum percentage of investments in Canada to be in decarbonization projects. We must stop there. I give you a little bit more time. So we will now turn towards, I believe Mr. Brendan Epp will give the opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable members. Je vous remercie de nous donner l'occasion de
Thank you for giving us the opportunity to contribute to the to the conversation today.
for you on behalf of 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trades and more than 200,000 businesses of all sizes from all sectors of the economy and from every part of our country. Tout d'abord, permettez-moi de souligner que la Chambre de commerce du Canada importance primordiale
We recognize the importance of reaching net zero the net zero goals from coast to coast, and it is important for our members to succeed in the transition to clean energy, as we represent not only the sectors and companies most involved in this transition, but also the communities across the country that they support.
We acknowledge that climate change poses a significant challenge to business, from the high cost of disruptive events to increased uncertainty for companies in what and how they should invest. Our financial system is, of course, also exposed to these risks. According to the SFAC Secretariat, Canada faces an annual investment gap of $115 billion to achieve its net zero transition goals. Even with federal investment in decarbonization, a significant gap persists. With the federal government nearing its fiscal capacity, provinces and municipalities will also face increased climate-related expenses. Business capital investments in climate and clean tech reached 14 billion Canadian dollars last year, as reported by RBC. However, business capital investments needs to increase, as do contributions from public markets, private equity, and venture capital. To fund, scale, and support innovative green technologies, a collaborative effort between government, industry, and investors is essential. This cooperation will equip the Canadian economy with the necessary tools and support to realize its net zero ambitions.
But before we can talk about Canada's broad investment in net zero across government and the private sector, we first need to ensure that Canada is a competitive environment for investment writ large. New tax increases that foster uncertainty and phase-outs of incentives that stifle investment and signal to the world's innovators to look elsewhere are not helping to attract or retain the kind of entrepreneurs and investors that are going to advance bleeding-edge, made-in-Canada net zero solutions. Additionally, investors require clarity, guidance, and data about opportunities to invest in Canada's net zero transition in order to accelerate capital flows, create the jobs of tomorrow, and grow our economy. Without access to this information and these tools, Canada cannot be globally competitive in fueling net zero investment. Canada should adopt a common definition for what constitutes investment that supports net zero. Greater transparency on Canada's transition plans would help track progress, facilitate accountability, and help the private sector plan investment strategies. In addition, the development and standardization of climate-related transition and physical risk disclosures, ideally with as much harmonization as possible, while accounting for Canada's unique challenges and opportunities, will enable organizations to track and accelerate their progress, provide information and confidence to investors. Initial guidance issued by OSFI is a positive step. It is worth noting that many of Canada's largest federally regulated financial institutions participated on the government's Sustainable Finance Action Council, which has made a variety of recommendations to advance progress towards developing and building a strong and successful sustainable finance marketplace. These recommendations have not yet advanced. In the absence of standardized Canadian-specific guidance, a patchwork of various standards and guidance has emerged within Canada and around the world, leaving businesses and investors frustrated and confused as to why as they plan and navigate their net zero ambitions. All the while, Canada gets farther from achieving its goals and attracting the kind of investment that will grow and sustain our economy for generations to come. The Canadian Chamber's Green Transition Finance Council and Net Zero Council are ready and willing to support. My colleague Brian and I will be pleased to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go now to Mr. Keeley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak today. Business and finance have crucial roles to play in forging national and transnational outcomes, including greater social inclusivity and environmental sustainability. but their most appropriate roles have been increasingly maligned and misunderstood as climate hysterics have become commonplace. Understanding the optimal role of business and finance in forging the social, environmental, and economic outcomes we all desire requires a sober analysis of the challenge of climate change itself, as well as a deeper appreciation of essential fiduciary rules, the determinant roles of consumers and regulators, and the ancillary role of commerce. Financiers and businesses have no special powers nor any innate responsibility to right others' wrongs or turn the carbon clock backwards. Achieving a more inclusive, sustainable economic growth model requires that regulators, public policies, civic society, and individuals coalesce along with corporations around very specific patterns of behavior. Let me state this more plainly. If consumers continue to demand ever-rising quantities of fossil fuels, it is the responsibility of fossil fuel producers to provide those resources as cleanly and as cheaply as possible. Full stop. The challenge of climate change is daunting. It consists of two intractable problems wrapped into one. The first is a collective action problem. Today, 3 countries, China, India, and Russia, account for more than twice the greenhouse gas emissions generated by the European Union and the North American continents combined. Unless and until China, India, and Russia adopt equally ambitious targets for emissions as this body and much of the rest of the Western world already have, the prospects for achieving the goals of the Paris Accord, namely net zero by 2050, is itself zero. Aligning one's financial system to an outcome that is highly unlikely to be achieved guarantees financial and macroeconomic underperformance. If I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is this: avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain. Imposing a wrongly conceived paradigm upon your financial system would serve no useful purpose. Given ESG investment strategies have underperformed broader, more diversified strategies by more than 250 basis points per annum over just the last 5 years, the cost to individual Canadian pensioners over time would almost certainly amount to tens of billions of dollars of lost income. The second dimension of our climate challenge is a multivariable optimization problem. Canada, like every other country, is duty-bound to have a national energy policy that is clean, affordable, reliable, and ideally abundant. After all, energy security is part of national security. Canada is blessed with abundant choice between oil and gas, nuclear, hydro, wind, and to a lesser extent, solar. Exploit your advantages. Most other nations are not as fortunately situated. China and India continue to rely upon coal for more than half of their electricity supply. Given their needs for economic growth, it is wholly unreasonable to expect that India, Nigeria, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries, which collectively account for 2/3 of global population, will dramatically alter their production and use of fossil fuels in manners consistent with Paris-mandated objectives. Pope Francis himself wrote in his encyclical Laudato Si, "We are not faced with separate crises, one environmental, another economic, but rather one complex crisis with multiple challenges. Solutions demand an integrated approach. We must combat poverty, restore dignity to the excluded, and protect nature all at the same time." I am not a climate denier. The evidence for anthropomorphic impacts on our land, air, and water is in plain sight, available for everyone to see. Given our collective action failures and multivariable needs, however, global temperatures are heading higher. This means in the mitigation versus adaptation debate, public policy should lean more heavily towards adaptation. The globe has never had to sustain 10 billion souls simultaneously. It will soon have no choice. How 10 billion souls sustainably occupy our planet in the centuries to come remains among humanity's most significant challenges. And climate risk certainly portends significant economic and financial risk, as everyone on this panel will say. All this said, government regulations which force Canadian pension plans to restrict their investments into climate-aligned indices or strategies will not help create a climate-aligned world. Canadians can divest their way to a green portfolio, but they cannot divest their way to a green globe. Decarbonizing industrial production requires massive amounts of investment, not divestment. Moreover, divestiture does not stop companies from making unwanted decisions. It merely impacts their cost of capital and transfers ownership from those who don't support a given management team and strategic direction to those who more broadly do. Responsible investors allocate capital most wisely when they properly anticipate the world that will be, not some imagined hope-for world that has a very low probability of bearing out. In practice, this requires investing in a very broad range of companies, industries, and real assets, including many brown ones. with significant prospects for becoming more green. It also involves the provision of patient capital to the most promising technologies that lower what Microsoft founder Bill Gates has called the green premium, which is the difference between existing practice and less carbon
Unfortunately,
intensive.
we're going to have to stop there, but I'm sure there will be many questions. So whatever points we're upcoming.
Green bonds.
Well, that's good. We're a nice committee. We like to hear nice stuff like that. So we'll go now to I guess it's Mr. Clark who will be. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Chair. I'm pleased to be here today on behalf of the Insurance Bureau of Canada and its members to speak about our advocacy on climate change that relates to the impacts on the Canadian financial system. IBC is the National Industry Association representing home, auto, and business insurers. Our members make up the vast majority of the property and casualty insurance market in the country. For 60 years, IBC has worked with governments and insurance regulators across the country to help make home, auto, and business insurance available and affordable for Canadians. The reality is that Canada is becoming a riskier place to live, work, and insure due to the level of risk we face from extreme weather events as a result of climate change. To date, regulatory discussions concerning climate risk disclosure and the ongoing work to establish a green taxonomy inadequately consider physical risk and have overemphasized transition risk in relative terms. For a country where natural disasters have consistently disrupted economic activity, this emphasis should be reversed. Last summer, as wildfire smoke from Quebec blanketed Ottawa and parts of the eastern seaboard, I walked outside with my 4.5-year-old son who said, "Dada, it smells like camping." In 2023, Canada faced the worst wildfire season in its history, with over 6,600 fires that burned more than 18.5 million hectares, forcing the evacuation of at least 155,000 people from their homes, all at a cost of more than $1.4 billion just to fight these fires. These wildfires led to the cumulative release of CO2 equivalent to the global airline industry's emissions in a single year. And the challenge that we are faced with right now is that this year could be even worse. We are also seeing that flooding events are becoming more severe. As of today, 1.5 million households in Canada are built in areas of high risk of coastal, riverfront, and urban flooding. These households lack affordable and adequate insurance. Over the past 8 years, IBC has advocated for a low-cost national flood insurance program for high-risk households in partnership with our industry to close this protection gap. Budget 2024 confirmed that the government intends to launch such a program next year in 2025. Last year, severe weather events in communities across Canada caused $3.5 billion in insured damage alone, one of the highest annual totals in the previous 4 decades. But unlike in 2016, when a huge wildfire ravaged Fort McMurray and caused a quarterly contraction in national GDP, the losses last year weren't attributed primarily to one single catastrophe. Instead, climate-related disasters affected almost every part of Canada. Because of the threat of more frequent and intense natural disasters in all part of the country, we support the federal government's commitment in Budget 2024 to develop a green taxonomy, which represents an opportunity to catalyze new investments. However, our industry believes that the greatest challenges in this country are from the physical risks we face from climate change, and greater efforts need to be focused on driving capital to enhance resilience. Canada's P&C insurers have been at the front lines of climate change for many years, sounding the alarm with governments and regulators, proposing policy solutions, and pricing and managing climate risks. In fact, OSFI recently highlighted the industry's leadership in the What We Heard report, following their survey of financial institutions on readiness to implement Guideline B15, climate risk management. The report notes P&C insurers are further ahead than other financial institutions in establishing climate-related risk reporting and metrics, and it recognizes P&C insurers' experience in managing physical risks such as weather-related and natural catastrophes. The report also found that P&C insurers are further ahead than others on formalizing climate-related roles and responsibility for board members and senior management. As we reduce our emissions, Canada must also urgently improve its climate defenses. This includes investing in new infrastructure to protect communities from floods and fires, improving building codes, ensuring better land use planning, and increasingly creating incentives to shift the development of homes and businesses away from high-risk areas. Further, to rapidly advance resilience measures, IBC co-founded Climate Proof Canada, a national coalition that I'm fortunate enough to chair, which has played an important advisory role in helping establish the country's first national adaptation strategy. For more than a decade, IBC has been warning governments about the need to be better prepared for severe weather events as a result of climate change. We believe Canada must play both offense and defense when it comes to climate change and take action today to protect Canadians from the growing threat to their homes and well-being. We look forward to this committee's continuing study of the environment and climate-related impacts of the Canadian financial sector and the role that property and casualty insurers are already playing. Thank you for the invitation to speak, and we look forward to hearing.
Merci, merci beaucoup. Alors, on tombe dans le premier.
Thank you very much. So now we are going to start the first round of questions, and we will start with Mr. Mazier. Floor is yours.
Thank you for the witnesses that are coming out this afternoon. Mr. Keeley, my questions will be for you this afternoon. Can a government meet their environmental targets by regulating the financial system or mandating climate risk disclosures?
I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that for us to achieve a net zero world, we're going to have individuals, public policies, a wide range of other forms of taxes and to create the world that we want to see. Businesses are in an ancillary position. They're not in a leading position. So to actually say that we can regulate business and finance to a greener world is, I think, misguided.
The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions has introduced mandatory climate-related financial disclosure expectations for financial institutions in Canada. What are the risks associated with climate-related disclosures or ESG scores?
Well, any good financier will tell you that having more information is better and more disclosures is better, but it's the question of how that information would be utilized. To the extent, the best example would be that Scope 1, Scope 2, and ideally Scope 3 emissions would be required to be reported. But what would be done with that information is particularly dangerous. To the extent that we are going to result in a situation where we're merely divesting from brown companies, divesting from brown buildings, starving them of capital, will have exactly the wrong answer to our climate problems. We actually need to invest in those industries, not divest.
Is there a financial risk to the retirement savings of individual Canadians if a government attempts to meet environmental targets through pension and investment funds?
That particular risk is huge, daunting, and would almost certainly result in the loss of hundreds of billions of dollars of income over many years to Canadian pensioners. We need to invest in the world that will be, not some imagined world. As we all know, the ESG strategies that have been, there's $45 trillion in ESG strategies. It's not that these strategies are underfunded, dear friends. It's that they simply don't work. And they have been underperforming markets by 250 basis points for the last 5 years. That's going to result, if we continue in that path, underfunded pensions, people that cannot support themselves in their old age.
I forgot to actually expand on the divestment part of this. Will divestment achieve environmental objectives, and should Canadians be concerned with this approach?
I think everyone should be concerned, not just Canadians. I think there was a recent episode with ExxonMobil where we all saw that they were a number of investors voted, they remained shareholders and put in new board members. Right now, ExxonMobil is one of the leading investors in carbon capture. Thank God investors stayed engaged with ExxonMobil to help move them in the right direction. Divestiture is almost certainly the exact opposite of what we require right now to create the world that we want.
And how do you turn that tide? What else can you advise this committee as far as, because that is a common theme in this talk, is get out of that and it'll just basically, the businesses will die. Is there anything else we can think about divestment and actually maybe something else we should consider there?
I think that debate is now raging on college campuses across the United States. As we all know, everybody's calling for the divestiture of Amazon, the divestiture of companies that they think will somehow end fighting in Gaza. We have to understand how limited divestiture is as a tool for solving our problems. Divestiture is not the way to go if you're actually trying to influence a corporation's behavior or affect an economic outcome.
You've stated, and I quote, committing to net zero portfolio target today is somewhat like agreeing to a gluten-free diet before knowing which foods contain gluten or what nutrients one might be sacrificing in the process, end quote. Can you explain what you mean by this?
Well, Thank you for reading my book. At least somebody has. It's very clear that we don't know what this divestiture movements will actually create. That $45 trillion that I spoke about is largely based upon divestiture. And many, many individuals have adopted these ESG indices that MSCI and others are coming out with. And they're basically signing up for investing in less than 1/2 of the investable market. Of the 500 corporations in the S&P 500, only 230 are currently fully aligned with net zero 2050. Why would anybody decide that they're only going to invest in those companies when, in fact, it is the browner ones that have the chance to become better corporations and outperform over time?
If pension and investment funds adopt net zero portfolios, would this do anything to achieve a net zero world?
Clearly not. A green portfolio does not create a green world. If it did, we would have gotten rid of smoking, gambling, alcohol, tobacco, firearms. All of these have been divested from over decades, and yet you can still grab a pack of cigarettes and have a beer. Divestiture has not worked to solve the underlying problems.
Bill Gates has said, and I quote, ESG investing so far has probably not removed 1 ton of carbon out of the air. Do you agree with this statement? And if so, what are the implications of allocating trillions of dollars in capital to ESG portfolios that do not reduce a quantifiable amount of emissions?
I think Bill Gates just summarized, as we have been discussing, the limited efficacy of divestiture as a tool for changing the world and changing industry. That's what Bill Gates was referring to in that quote. I obviously agree with him. I quoted him in my book.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Vancouverton now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all the witnesses for being here and sharing your vast expertise with us. Many of us, including myself, are just learning about terms. We've all Googled what a sustainable finance taxonomy is in the last couple of weeks, and we're just getting off the grounds here. But and I say that about myself. There are people here that know more about that than me, but these meetings have been really helpful in learning more about that. So my first question is to you, Mr. Clark. I've read that Canada's insured losses over the last couple of years due to wildfires and other natural disaster events that are fueled by climate change, not always caused by climate change, causes a little bit of consternation sometimes in this committee, have increased markedly, and so have the insured losses. Can you talk a little bit about why that's the case and to the degree to which it's true, if it is?
Sure. Thank you for the question. I think the trend line in Canada is pretty clear. We're seeing an increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events as a result of climate change. And we're seeing, I mentioned in my remarks, a comparison to 2016 in the Fort McMurray fires. Also noting that that's a community that was just had evacuation orders to neighborhoods just days ago, actually. And so what we've seen over the past number of years, and in particular, whether it's 2022, 2023, we've seen $3.4 billion in insured losses alone. That doesn't capture the full loss that we're seeing as a result of these events or these activities. There's also infrastructure loss. There's losses to productivity. There's business loss. So not to mention homeowner loss. So a big part of our work has been to work with the federal government on a low-cost national flood insurance program to help ensure that Canadians are better protected.
Well, thank you for that. I have a follow-up question. I've read recently that upwards of half of the world's displaced people last year due to wildfires were Canadian. Canada's 0.5% of the world's population, but accounted for almost half of the world's displaced people due to wildfires. Do you think it stands to say that Canada actually has more to lose with respect to the impacts of climate change? I've heard that Canada is warming more quickly than other countries. Would you say that's the case?
We are exceptionally concerned about this trend line. We are exceptionally concerned about the conditions that we're seeing. Even just today, the Canadian Hurricane Centre released its expectations of the forthcoming hurricane season, which they noted would be significant or very active, and that aligns with what we've seen out of the U.S. Just announced days ago. So we are, whether it's multi-peril, so whether that's wildfire, flooding, or extreme heat, another very significant threat to Canadian communities across the country. We are exceptionally concerned. Currently, the Canadian property and casualty insurance industry is very well placed, and we are seeing full coverage with the exception of high-risk flooding, and there's an opportunity to work together on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And given that Canada seems to be more vulnerable because we're a large country, so sometimes it takes more time for emergency services. We have a lot of forests, so we're vulnerable to things like forest fires. We tend to have seasons, and that comes with seasonal weather. Do you think it would be, this is a little bit personal perhaps, do you think it would be responsible, given our vulnerability, to be not one of the leaders lowering our emissions and demonstrating a commitment to fighting climate change globally?
If I look at what we have worked on with respect to the green taxonomy as an example, we think it's important to both reduce emissions and ensure that we're adapting to climate change. The way that we put it is because the country is becoming riskier, we need to play offense and we need to play defense. We think that the work that was done to establish the country's first national adaptation strategy was incredibly important. We've seen $1.6 billion invested so far. I would suggest more needs to be done there. There's additional opportunities. We need to make sure that we're doing things like ensuring that we're not building homes in high-risk zones, so that we're building homes in the right way, so that they're low carbon, but also so that we're not putting them in high-risk, say, flood or wildfire zones. Yes.
And just very, very briefly, does disclosure equal divestment? It seems like there's been a little bit of a direct line drawn on this committee today.
I couldn't speak to divestment on behalf of our members. What I could say is the property and casualty insurance industry has worked very closely with OSFI, our federal regulator, on B15 guidelines to ensure that we are appropriately prepared for climate-related risks, in particular physical risks. And so our concern very much is to ensure the soundness of our industry as it relates to this increasing trend line which we've talked about.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Keeley, with the remaining time I have available, I have a question for you, and it starts with a quote. The quote is, "We have a grave responsibility to ensure that children not be denied their future. The climate run amok is crying out to all of us to halt this illusion of omnipotence. We need a turning point, demonstrating a clear and tangible political will that can lead to a decisive acceleration of ecological transition." Do you know who said that?
I do not know who said it, but I do not, I think disclosure is a good thing. I think that was directed towards me. Disclosures are a good thing. They're not equated with divestment. I wanted to make that point.
I'm glad to hear that, and thank you. The person who quoted that was the Pope. It seems as though in your opening statement, you characterized some of the Pope's positioning as not as a climate activist. He actually is quite a climate activist.
Very much so. He's very much so. And he endorsed my book, by the way, on the cover.
Fabulous. Congratulations.
Unfortunately,
sir,
we're going to...
I have one last question.
Go ahead, very quickly.
Mr. Keeley, do you feel like emissions ought to be measured per capita, per person, or by flag?
I don't know what good any of those would do, but I think that we all should be examining our carbon footprints individually, if that's the question.
Perfect.
Thank
you. Thanks. Madame Posey.
Ms. Posey, thank you to all of our witnesses. I have questions for Mr. Sénécal and Mr. Riom. Your company distinguished itself by having the first fund in Canada that is green. In Canada, they have very strict requirements. You are in alignment with the climate bonds taxonomy. Are you familiar with S243? It's finance aligned with climate by Ms. Rosa Valdez. You say that you are. You work in a specific sector. Do you think that this project would encourage stability on Canada's financial markets? Thank you. We are familiar with it. This is a disclosure method related to OSFI and the ISB. If we have more disclosure on from banks with regards to their loans, their portfolios, with regards to the risks of their investments in climate, then we assume that they will have to disclose what is necessary. I think that disclosure is a positive thing because it allows investors to make a choice. Putting pressure on them depends on what goal we intend to reach, be it through our own behavior, personal choices, and so on. We need all of these tools in order to provoke change in an economy in which there are multiple stakeholders. AlphaFix has supported the CAFA bill because we think that it will provide more disclosure. Excellent. So more transparency. Do you think that the Canadian financial system is currently ready to face the threat of climate change? It's to say that I think that the Canadian financial system is in good health, and it's difficult to quantify exactly what risks you're referring to. There is still some work to be done. You mentioned disclosure. I'm an investor. We are always trying to evaluate the risks. So more information we have, the better we are, the more tools we have to quantify such things. But to ask if the Canadian system has the right tools now, yes. Well, at our first meeting on this topic, a witness told us that the Canadian financial system is not as successful as we think it is. Our GDP and our productivity is struggling, and there is no uptake on the horizon. So you don't have the same perspective. I would not necessarily attach that to climate change. We obviously do have challenges with regards to productivity, for example, in Canada. The financial system is very robust. I don't think that I'm not worried particularly. With regards to your green fund, that contributed to the funding of renewable energies. In your opinion, what is the approach that would allow us to decarbonize electricity production as quickly as possible in Canada? Green bonds would allow us to do that, but there are places in Canada where the price of electricity can't be fixed ahead of time. It is a market price, and that increases the risk of those projects with regards to being investment. And then there are purchasing power agreements, which make those projects viable and then allow us to spend capital. Right now in Canada, there are places that it's possible, but provincial regulation doesn't allow us to fund those projects because they are not economically viable yet compared to other projects that are not in line with clean energies. So increasing the price of electricity would help. Sorry, I'm having trouble with the microphone. So I'd like to talk about finances again. Earlier you said that the system seems robust, but the OECD published a report on biodiversity, and it says that the capital is not properly distributed. We know that capital is impacted by climate change, and the risks to biodiversity are linked to capital. Earlier, I asked if we were ready to face climate change. I was kind of referring to what the OECD says. I'm going to talk about insurance companies that know a lot about physical risks. Those bring biodiversity risks. Climate risks are more easily quantifiable than the domino effect that those events can have on biodiversity. Our behavior as corporations, as humans, and everything we do to the environment, the domino effect is very high towards biodiversity, and it seems that it's very much more difficult to quantify the measures. We must now move on to Ms. Collins.
I guess I want to start off by addressing one of the comments that was made by the witnesses around climate hysterics. Hysteria, it refers to something that is wildly emotional. It comes from the Greek word womb, of the womb. It is used in ancient Greek to refer to things associated with women. And I hope you'll forgive me if I get emotional. Climate emergencies are not gender neutral. The degradation of ecosystems disproportionately impacts women and girls. And I am wildly emotional. This is the existential crisis of our time. And to hear that we're asking for high ambition is climate hysteria, that makes me wildly emotional. Absolutely. You know, when I think about my womb, you know, the 2 children that I bore from that womb and what future we are leaving them, I am wildly emotional. And it's not surprising to hear this from someone who has written articles that are pro-life. I think that we need to think about the intersection of gender and the climate crisis. And I hope that the people around this table and the people listening will refrain from using language like climate hysteria. We are facing a climate emergency. So I'm going to start off my questions to Mr. Clark. I appreciated your comments about the existential crisis that we're facing. And a handful of insurance companies are already setting net zero goals and climate transition plans. I'm curious how legislative and regulatory mechanisms support insurance companies already doing this work, and really how do we get the ones who aren't, the majority who haven't committed to net zero goals, headed in that direction?
Thank you for the question. I think when we look at our members, when we look at, in particular, the work that we have been doing with OSFI on climate risk disclosure, which I think is incredibly important. In March of 2023, OSFI finalized its draft guidelines on B15, and it established its expectations for climate-related risk disclosures. In terms of where we are at right now, we are working on, our members are currently undertaking, and we're finalizing, they'll be conducting later this year, climate risk analysis on their full operations. And so it is incredibly important for us in order to ensure the soundness of our business so that we're delivering effectively on that. In terms of the one thing I wanted to mention, that in terms of when we think about net zero and we think about the investment portfolio of property and casualty insurers, which is slightly different, we have various restrictions in terms of investment concentration. So if you look at, say, last year, 2023, our invested assets equaled $139 billion, and 72% of that was bonds. So we are, and OSFI puts additional limitations on us to not overly invest in a single company or single industry series of companies in order to ensure that we have the reserves available to pay out for policyholders. So I would say it's incredibly important. You know, we are very seized with climate change and in particular the physical risk side of things that we're already seeing.
And the climate crisis poses an existential crisis, or threat to our society, but it also poses an existential threat to insurance companies. And, you know, because this is becoming more and more high risk, we're seeing, you know, devastating wildfires, flooding, communities impacted so severely by extreme weather. You know, it feels like those costs are being offloaded to consumers. It feels like there are communities that are going to become uninsurable. That, you know, really concerns me. And at the same time, insurance companies are also investing and underwriting fossil fuel projects. And so at what point does investing and underwriting fossil fuels violate insurers' fiduciary obligations to their policyholders, especially those who are facing increased risk due to the climate crisis?
So I'm not able to speak to any specific investment or any specific policy that's been underwritten by our members. That's under the Competition Act. I can't speak to that. However, I think when you're talking about the focus on, in particular, the physical risk and the threat and the challenge that we face from a pricing perspective, I think that's very real. We've seen it quite clearly in the last few years. StatsCan's just released updated new data on the impact that is having directly on insurers, and it's ultimately it is also having an impact on consumers in this country as well. And the rationale for that is that. What I mentioned in my remarks is that the country is becoming a riskier place. Essentially, policies are priced on risk, and as a community or a household's risk rises without corresponding investments to make sure that we're mitigating that risk, which is incredibly important.
Well, I have to stop there. I'm going to next round. I'm going to have to reduce the time by 20%, so it'll be 4 minutes and 2 minutes. I'd go longer, but we didn't get an extension of resources today, but we did ask. Okay, Mr. Leslie, for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Keeley, in your opening statements, you mentioned that ESG investment strategies have broadly underperformed more diversified strategies by a specific number of 250 basis points per annum over the past 5 years. So I'm curious, in terms of real dollar values, what does that actually look like? And if there were to be a Liberal NDP bloc-imposed ESG mandate, how many billions of dollars would you potentially expect the Canadian pension plan, the most important safety net for Canadians, to potentially lose in the coming years?
So the Canadian pension plan, if I understand, is worth right now about $650 billion Canadian. You can just take 2.5% of that per year and subtract it from what it would otherwise be if you continue in the ESG strategies. That, of course, amounts to tens of billions of dollars, really in less than a decade. So it's quite a meaningful sum of money.
Thank you. And globally speaking, are there examples of other nations that have tried to achieve environmental targets via financial systems, and what has the results of those been?
Thankfully, no. There has been a renewed focus on fiduciary rules. I was asking one of my Canadian friends whether or not Canada has the same fiduciary rule as they have in the United States. Fiduciary rules, largely speaking, preclude the investment strategies that are suboptimal, that is to say, achieve poor risk-adjusted returns. I think that I'm not exactly sure of what the Canadian equivalent is of a fiduciary rule, but if you have one, it solves a lot of your problems.
Thank you. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that energy security is part of national security, and obviously we've had many nations come to Canada looking for clean Canadian liquefied natural gas, to which our government has decided that there is no business case because we've made it so difficult for projects to move forward. In your view, would imposing an ESG mandate on financial institutions or pension funds make it even more difficult for Canadian energy projects to access funding potentially?
It almost certainly would be counterproductive in the extreme. That is to say, what you want to do to create a greener world, which I do want to create a greener world, you need to turn brown companies green, and you actually need to stop consuming fossil fuels, and you need to switch to a much cleaner energy mix. In Canada's case, that would be more nuclear. Climate change is a huge challenge, but to describe it as an existential threat is an excellent example, and I won't use the word hysterical, of gross exaggeration that actually clouds clear thinking on the matter.
No, thank you. And I recognize that Canada has some of the most stringent environmental and labor regulations in the world. I'm a believer that we should be exporting our bounty of natural resources around the world rather than have it being produced in countries like, as you mentioned, Russia or China or India or Iran or Venezuela. Is it preferable, in your view, that we produce more in this country versus the countries I just listed or others around the world?
I applaud every member of this committee and all Canadians who are trying to do their part in creating a greener world. I just, as I tried to state in my opening remarks, feel that it's fairly logical and we should continue to expect that temperatures are going higher. So when it comes to prioritizing public assets and public expenditures, the approach of adaptation will be far better spent than mitigation.
In your view, how should we rank the importance of measuring outcomes and results of our policies? And in your view, would a ESG mandate aid the improvement of environmental outcome results in any way?
Very briefly, please. You have 10 seconds.
Yeah, do I have time or no?
10 seconds.
10 seconds.
Basically a yes or no.
The answer is no.
Longfield for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one brief question, and I'll turn the rest of my time over to Mr. Turnbull. My question is for Mr. Senecal. You piqued my interest when you talked about electricity and getting to a cleaner grid. A few summers ago, a group of us visited the nuclear facility at Bruce Power. We were talking about green bonds at the time and the opportunity to have nuclear included in Canada's green bond policy. And since, I guess, November 21st, 2023, certain nuclear energy expenditures are now eligible under Green Bond Program. Knowing how important it is to attract international investment into high capital expenditure areas such as nuclear, could you comment on whether we've gone far enough? Is this heading in the right direction?
Thank you for the question. So I think, well, first of all, nuclear was part of the climate bonds taxonomy since like 2018, from what I remember. So it's just that it is, as you all know, a controversial topic. But still, in terms of low carbon solutions to produce electricity, it is up there. It is the lowest type of electricity production. So yes, some issuers in Canada have revised their green bond framework lately. And it is one of the solutions to live in a greener, low-carbon world. So,
thank you. I think it's the change that we've seen in terms of being able to get to medical isotopes, as another example. That Ontario, the Bruce Power said that it was really a missing piece that they needed to see us working on.
I'm sorry, I missed what did they add?
Okay, I think I'm taking up too much time. If I can maybe go over to Mr. Turnbull, please.
I wanted to ask thanks to my colleague, Mr. Longfield. Ms. Brendan Jepp and Mr. Decho, wanted to ask you, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has a working group on sustainable finance, as I understand it, and I've met with them quite a number of times, which is great. I know that you've been active advocating for a green taxonomy and mandatory climate-related disclosures. Could you describe why those are so important as enabling conditions to attract additional investment and mobilize capital to fight climate change?
Thank you for the question. And thank you for taking the time to meet with the Canadian Chamber and members of our Green Transition Finance Council. The Canadian Chamber believes that we require an inclusive Made in Canada framework, which addresses the unique opportunities and challenges facing Canada in its transition and supports Canadians in that transition. So really, it's about creating a full suite of tools that businesses and investors can feel confident in and rely on as they make investment decisions.
My understanding is that credibility and certainty within the market is what really are kind of the enabling conditions for capital to flow. Do you see these two tools, taxonomy, which is a classification system for green and transition products, and then disclosure information, which truly, I think, arms investors with decision useful data? Are those two, can you speak to just how important those tools are in terms of increasing credibility and transparency in the market?
Well, certainly, I think businesses have been advocating for these tools for quite some time, and so has SFAC. And so I think in order to increase Canada's productivity and grow our economy, these are really essential to attracting investors. We know that.
Merci. On doit passer. Je m'excuse de vous.
I'm very sorry to cut you off, but our time is tight and short today. Ms. Posey, so 2 minutes. I'll have to go very quickly. First, as a representative to the representative Canadian Chamber of Commerce, in a recent report from 2024 at page 32, it says that the Chamber of Commerce promotes things such as tar sands, pipelines, and so on. And it says that in 2022 that you were against the capping of emissions to a certain amount. But earlier you said that your priority was the fight against climate change. So which one is your priority? The fight against climate change or promoting the oil and gas interests of Canada? Thank you for your question. If I will answer in English if you'll allow me, because I'm more at ease.
I think the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and many of its members certainly agree that we have a strong role to play in reducing our emissions, and that has been always a focus of many of our members. But I think one thing that we also need to take into consideration is Canada's role in the world and our abilities to support one of our strongest performing sectors. So I'm not just focusing on the sector that you mentioned, but also the critical minerals that we have in this country and our ability to help support other nations as they also try to decarbonize their efforts.
Je m'excuse de vous interrompre.
Sorry to cut you off. I only have 2 minutes. So you do think that there is a link between climate change and fossil fuels. So I have a question either for you or for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. It's about the boards of directors. I want to say that they are maybe infiltrated or influenced by representatives from oil and gas sector. Is there anything that we should be working on? You talked about taxonomy. The Chamber of Commerce talked about it. But if we have to define a taxonomy and representatives from the oil and gas sector are there, then we won't be able to do this. Sadly, we don't have time for an answer, but we've understood what you're trying to get at. Ms. Collins.
Yeah, again, it's not surprising to me that the Conservatives have spent most of their time asking questions about divestment to someone who is maligning the divestment movement. Young people are using so many tools, whether it is divestment, engagement, or activism, and they're trying to use whatever tools they can right now in the face of a climate crisis. It's not surprising also that, the climate neo-denialism, that we don't have to be that ambitious, is aligned with folks who don't fully support a woman's right to choose. It's also, to me, telling that the Conservative leader has refused to say whether he would scrap the industrial carbon price. And my question is to Ms. Brannan-Jepp. The federal backstop when it comes to the industrial carbon price is one of the most critical policies that we have. Industrial carbon pricing does the bulk of our emissions reduction. The Pathways Alliance new head has actually called on the Conservative leader to state his position on the industrial carbon price and whether he would keep. It's wild to me that when we're in a position where oil and gas leaders are more climate friendly than a leader of a political party in Canada. That's wild. But I'm curious from your perspective of creating certainty, what does that kind of uncertainty do?
I think Canada should increase overall net zero funding and do more to de-risk and address barriers to private sector investment. We hear from our members all the time that they very much appreciate partnerships with government and private sector funders to enhance and innovate, find bleeding edge solutions to our greatest climate challenges. And so I think this is really where...
And particularly on the industrial carbon pricing question, is greater certainty better for...
Yeah, 15 seconds, please, on that, yeah.
If I may jump in very quickly, one thing that we've been advocating on very consistently is that certainty and predictability. I think we've seen a number of projects put on hold for a number of different reasons, and I think one of the main reasons for many is that lack of certainty and predictability.
Thank you. Mr. Cram for 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to introduce the witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital to our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce, and I would like our witnesses from the Chamber of Commerce to meet our witnesses from Alpha Fix Capital. It seems that Alpha Fix Capital is a very successful green investment firm with billions of dollars in green green bonds and green investment funds. It seems that the Canadian Chamber of Commerce has many good green investment opportunities. So I can't help but wondering, why are you guys spending your afternoon talking with a room full of politicians instead of talking with each other about all these investment opportunities that you could work together on, and instead of asking for more government regulations? And wouldn't it be better if politicians step back and let you guys do your thing, and we could have a greener, better economy as a result?
Some of the challenges that we are facing. As successful as we were in our green bonds, the transition has been a much tougher challenge. And we are trying to replicate the success factors in the green bond to the transition world. That's why we're here, just to say there's a piece missing, and that piece is the taxonomy for the transition. And yeah, I'm glad to come here and chat, but I do have other things to do. But at the same time, I think it's important to, there are some very low-hanging fruits, and that's one of them. So what's holding back the taxonomy? Not sure, but it's holding back investments. As long as companies do not know the rules of the game, do not know where the goalposts are, it's very difficult for them to allocate capital.
And from the Chamber of Commerce, like why does the government have to be the one providing the taxonomy? Why can't you guys communicate with each other?
Well, I'm pleased to say that we do regularly communicate with our members. In fact, Brian and I both have councils that do a great inanimate amount of work in this area. And what our members are really telling us is that greater certainty and clarity is required. That said, there are a number of innovative solutions that our members are trying to drive forward, and they're excited to do so, and they're looking to attract more capital to be able to let business be business and innovate and come up with those bleeding edge solutions that are going to drive our net zero ambitions.
Okay, let's come back to Mr. Keeley. Mr. Keeley, in your opening statement, you said, if I have one piece of advice for this committee, it is to avoid a great deal of economic and financial sacrifice for no apparent gain. Could you elaborate on what you meant by that?
Yeah, sure. I think that I think we got into a lot of it in the course of the discussion, which is divestiture. And all of these issues about greater disclosures, almost certainly just lead back to the divestiture question. People would end up divesting from those who are dirtier industries, and that's not going to solve things. So I would just, strongly say that if we're going to decarbonize our industries, if we're going to make the grid greener, if we're going to have an effective carbon tax, I would recommend a carbon border adjustment tax, which has been recommended by Paul Ryan. Those would be far more sensible approaches than to impose a net zero portfolio restriction on your pensioners. We need to ask the question, we're all concerned about the climate. It's a horrible situation. The world is outliving its resources. There's no question. But what can Canadian pensioners actually do about that?
Okay, thank you.
I thought that was the question.
Thank you.
And Canadian pensioners do not solve the crisis by divesting.
Yeah. You go to Ms. Taylor-Roy, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to extend my thanks to all the witnesses for taking their valuable time to speak to our committee. As we know, as representatives, we cannot do our jobs without speaking to the people on the front lines. So your being here is very important to our committee's deliberations on this matter. And Mr. Keeley, you've received a lot of questions today. I will not be asking you one, but I did want to thank you because several times you have emphasized that the most important thing we can do is to have consumers stop consuming fossil fuels. And that is exactly what the Price on Pollution program is designed to do. It's to incorporate the environmental costs of consuming fuels into the price signal so that people will, in fact, consume less. So I appreciate your endorsement of those programs. But I would like to talk to the Chamber of Commerce because there seems to be some confusion about the impact of capital flows on businesses and what that does, not only to the businesses, their ability to invest, but also to share prices. I think about the example of Reddit. I think when they shorted GameStop And it was really interesting. You know, the supply and demand in terms of people investing in certain stocks or disinvesting from certain stocks actually has a great impact on the economic performance of that company in the stock market, perhaps not fundamentally. And so this idea that somehow we cannot make any difference by directing the flow of capital to those companies which are in green pursuits seems to me to be misguided. And I was wondering to Jessica, I'm sorry I've forgotten your last name. I wrote down your first name. But to Jessica, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of having investment flows come into companies, that it's clear. You mentioned earlier that it has to be very clear to investors what the parameters are. But obviously that is so that they feel comfortable investing in these companies. So what is the importance to your membership of having investment in these green and transitional companies?
Thank you for the question. Well, I think we know from SFAC that there is a large gap in investment, and I think it's been clear that Canada is struggling with its productivity and its economic growth. So I would go back to that, and that we have a $115 billion a year investment gap that Canada has to fill in order to deliver on our net zero and transition commitments. And so really when we speak to our members, what they're asking for is additional partnership with government to promote investment in innovative technologies, and also the clarity that investors are seeking to invest in these kinds of technologies. Brian?
And if I may jump in very quickly, I just wanted to note that the large majority of businesses in Canada are small and medium-sized enterprise, and they also need a lot of support as they try to green their operations. So we were happy to see in recent months and in the last budget some of the money that was owed to small and medium-sized businesses through the carbon rebate program actually flow towards those businesses, because that's another key pillar of our advocacy and of many of our members that are much closer to their communities across Canada.
We have
15 seconds for a comment, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I just want to say that closing that $115 billion gap, I think having some guidelines, a clear taxonomy, and disclosure will help direct the flow of capital to companies which are meeting those guidelines. So thank you for the work you're doing at the Chamber.
Well, that brings this panel to an end. I really want to thank all the witnesses for an excellent exchange. So we're going to pause briefly to onboard the two witnesses for the second panel, who are both on video conferencing, I guess, Madam Clerk. Yeah. Okay, thank you again. Nice to see everybody. Have a good afternoon. On reprend. Alors, nous avons deux témoins.
We'll start again. We have two witnesses. We have Eric Husher, who is appearing
from the UN, head of UNEP Finance Initiative. We also have from the OECD, Mr. Hugh Miller, who's an analyst. We will start with Mr. Usher. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to address the committee. So as presented, I'm with the UN. I'm with part of the UN that works with the finance sector to develop norms for sustainable finance, responsible investment. Of most relevance to this session is that we convene several of the net zero alliances, including the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which many Canadian financial institutions have signed on to as a means of setting credible science-based net zero targets. Now, as well documented by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision and many others, climate change poses risk to the financial system. Now, just last month, the Basel Committee formally incorporated climate risks into its core principles, which set out the overarching standards for regulations to keep the global financial system stable. So it's increasingly acknowledged that misalignment of capital flows with the global climate objectives may result in short, medium, and long-term financial risks for financial institutions individually, as well as affect financial stability overall. The financial industry is largely aware of these risks. In fact, voluntary industry action has been a key driver of sustainable finance around the world, including in Canada, reflected in many financial institutions integrating sustainability considerations into their operations. For example, they identify sustainability as a key priority within their business strategy and reflect this in their governance and compensation policies. They establish systems to analyze climate risks and the impact of their financing. They've begun making sustainability disclosures, and many are setting net zero targets on a voluntary basis. But the pace of progress is uneven, and therefore, in recent years, regulatory initiatives have increased substantially across jurisdictions. UNEP, UN Environment Program, has documented over 750 sustainable and green finance regulations established globally since the Paris Agreement was signed. These aim at, for example, increasing transparency of sustainability information, addressing greenwashing, strengthening climate-related risk management practices, and starting to mandate into transition planning. These developments are an important prerequisite for intensified net zero alignment across the financial system and the entire economy. Now, financial regulation can build on voluntary industry commitments to incentivize financing for Canada's economic transition towards a sound and sustainable economy. For instance, OSFI's new B15 climate risk management guidance is an important step in this direction. Reporting is needed to enhance the transparency, the credibility, and ultimately the effectiveness of net zero commitments across the economy, and ultimately to ensure the integrity of the transition. The development of international disclosure standards, including through the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, should be advanced as to ensure optimal allocation of capital to the net zero economy. Work by the Canadian Sustainability Standards Board to develop reporting standards aligned to the ISSB is very welcome in this context. Also, there is potential for a Canadian taxonomy to be used as a forward-looking tool to accelerate the net zero transition. Over 40 countries today have developed or are in the process of developing sustainability taxonomies. Europe already has 2 years of company reporting, whereby companies must disclose the share of their revenues, their capital expenditures, and their operating expenditures that are aligned with the EU taxonomy criteria. Results show that many sectors in the EU are investing heavily in the transition now, with CapEx alignment, so capital expenditures, consistently higher than revenues. Way out front in this are utilities, whose revenues are already 40% sustainability aligned, but they're investing almost 2/3, 63% of their CapEx in sustainability aligned assets. Real estate, as another example, is investing 27% of their CapEx in sustainability aligned building stock. It's important to highlight that finance cannot in itself fill a policy void, and therefore that financial regulation can only truly incentivize transition finance if mirrored by a whole of government approach to meaningful action and commitments in the real economy. In addition, voluntary and regulatory action must work hand in hand, giving financial institutions the necessary room to innovate and at the same time signaling towards stronger market uptake, learning, and ever-increasing ambition and innovation. Finally, the potential for regulatory fragmentation is serious, and the Canadian economy risks getting left behind if regulatory developments do not keep up with what's happening today in other regions. Without interoperable regulatory frameworks, sustainable finance can become disjointed and primarily compliance-driven, which is a missed opportunity for financial institutions to play their part in enabling the transition. Banks and investors need globally consistent regulatory standards and definitions in order to focus on the transition challenges ahead. As described, banks and other financial institutions have gone a long way to commit to and implement voluntary commitments. As far as possible, regulatory developments should be aligned with voluntary principles for greater consistency.
We're going to have to stop there.
Voluntary initiatives can provide leadership and best practice.
Yeah, we're going to have to stop there. Go to Mr. Miller now.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Hugh Miller. I'm a sustainable finance analyst at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, where I work on climate and broader environmentally related financial risks. It is well recognized both internationally and in Canada that climate change and environmental issues pose risks to the financial system through physical and transition risk channels. Moreover, that the financial system will play a crucial role in financing the necessary activities to achieve regional and global decarbonization targets to mitigate future fiscal risks from climate change. However, there is a misalignment between the majority of climate-related financial risks will materialize and the necessary financing of low-carbon activities needs to occur. To meet regional and global net zero targets, significant and urgent upscaling of finance is necessary to fund the energy transition and the shift towards low-carbon technologies, with 125 to 140 billion per year needed for Canada to achieve its 2050 target. Conversely, the financial risks stemming from climate change and other environmental issues are only starting to materialize and may only become significantly material later on in the transition. Hence, there is a potential timing mismatch between the materialization of financial risks and the investment required to mitigate the risks from climate change. To help overcome the long time horizon of climate-related financial risks, we need to bring these risks forward into the time frame which impacts the investment decisions of market participants. This will require transitioning from a point-in-time assessment of climate risk towards a forward-looking assessment. Indeed, the Canadian financial system has already started to embark on a forward-looking assessment of these risks with the joint climate transition scenario analysis pilot project between the Bank of Canada and the Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions. However, there are limitations to the currently available scenarios and their ability to analyze the potential risks from climate change, thereby limiting the ability of financial institutions to account for these risks in their decision-making functions. There are several actions which would advance the ability to assess the materiality of these forward-looking risks and capture them within time frames relevant for financial actors. First is the development of transition plan standards akin to those developed by the UK Transition Task Force, the UK TPT, as well as others, and the implementation of credible, comparable, and transparent transition plans to help financial market participants more accurately identify and manage climate-related financial risks. Financial institutions may incorporate forward-looking information, such as company-level emission targets, into their risk management functions. Moreover, these plans may provide input into the narrative of climate transition scenarios and help develop more realistic assumptions. Second is the clear classification system to identify both green and transitioning activities, by which finance can be clearly earmarked for in the form of taxonomy, which I'm aware that Canada is already in the process of developing. This should clearly outline the economic activities that qualify for financing earmarked with either a green or transition labels, whilst avoiding carbon lock-in. This should be complemented with clear guideline of how funds should be able to be classified as green based on definitions in the taxonomy. And then finally, environmental risks are broader than just climate change. Recently, we've seen several central banks, including the Dutch, French, Mexican, Brazilian, and Malaysian central banks, all publish an initial impact and dependency studies related to nature-related financial risks. The global economy, and by extension the financial system, is dependent upon ecosystem services provided by biodiversity and broader natural capital. Currently, we're seeing a rapid decline in biodiversity and natural capital, which may exacerbate the risk presented by climate change. Hence, to assess the potential impacts of climate, a broader scope is required to understand how different environmental risks may interact and magnify one another. An initial step for the Canadian financial system on this front would be to undertake a similar impacts and dependencies assessment, similar to the work done in other jurisdictions. Hence here, the OSG can help provide support for this technical analysis with the supervisory framework, which offers a 4-step guide to central banks and financial supervisors on how to technically assess nature-related financial risks. Thank you very much for your time and interest. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. We'll start our first round, the 6-minute round, with Mr. Deltel.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour à tous les collègues.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Hello to all of our witnesses. To Mr. Miller and Mr. Usher, welcome to this parliamentary committee. Before asking questions, I would like to tip my hat to the interpreters who work very hard. Our witnesses had a lot to say, and they spoke very quickly because they had very little time, and despite that, the interpreters did a very good job. We've been congratulating them and thanking them more often. I've wanted to do it for a very long time. Our witnesses have very important things to tell us. They did so very quickly, and our interpreters did a remarkable job.
Mr. Usher first. Mr. Usher, you talk about greenwashing. I would like to have some information from you. What is your definition of greenwashing? Can you give us some example of greenwashing and how it can be used by people to dodge their responsibilities?
Yeah. It's a very good question, and there's not a precise definition as today. I think if you take a consumer awareness view of greenwashing, is essentially selling a product based on some sort of something incorrect in what they're selling, and so there have been a couple of cases, a number of cases brought against companies, brought against investors, some by financial regulators, some by advertising regulators, which have been made accusations around mis-selling a product. And it's typically been products around how green we are, how net zero we are as a company or as a bank. But I think coming back to the transparency issue and also the need for a taxonomy, it's quite hard to have a clear definition of a greenwash unless you can have a definition essentially of transparency of what is sustainable versus what isn't. I hope that provides a partial answer.
Yes, well, obviously, as you said, it's not a very clear situation to address. But the point is that a lot of people are very upset when they see big meeting, in the middle of the desert with a lot of airplane and especially personal jet going there, and people saying, okay, they want to save the planet, but they use personal jet. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I think it requires company leaders to be able to justify the decisions they make, how they spend their company's resources. And I think a lot of company executives are getting some pressure in this area. At the same time, I think air travel is considered a critical form of transport. In some jurisdictions, like in Europe, you're seeing some countries who are regulating short-haul flights should be replaced by trains, where that under a couple hours of distance. But I think overall the view is that an industry like the air industry needs to continue, and it's going to take longer to decarbonize. It's one of the industries where there's a talk of the need of carbon offsets because it's hard to totally switch over. But other industries can move more quickly to provide a balance.
Well, my personal thought on that is that as long as people will use that kind of travel and that kind of event and that kind of event, and they make their own choice, well, the industry will work on that. But this is another issue. Let me be more positive now. You talk about room to innovate. You said that during your testimony a few minutes ago. Talk to us about room to innovate. How can the companies and big emissioner can reduce their emission by innovation? Do you have some example to provide to us?
We have a booming industry. We have $1.8 trillion US that invested in the energy transition last year, investing in new business models, new manufacturing, new uses of technologies. And so this is a booming market. It's a very sizable part of the economy. And I think one of the questions for Canada, how much of that market are Canadian companies going to capture?
So do you think that to have fiscal incentive in new technologies to reduce emission is a good roadmap to follow?
That's part of the roadmap. And I think to my comments, a whole of government approach is what's required. Incentives are certainly useful, particularly for new technologies that are not yet proven. However, incentives on their own probably are not sufficient. We need transparency in the market, and we need a regulatory framework that provides certainty and a sense of direction that the private sector can invest against. Just to give one example, Japan, they have issued transition pathways for their main sectors, their main industries. So they give for the steel, for cement, for agriculture, for buildings, a view to the private sector is to say, this is how we believe this industry is going to decarbonize. That provides signals of certainty that allows investors to invest against.
What about the green energies like hydroelectricity, éolien, solaire, geothermal, nuclear? Do you think that we should fast-tracking those projects, giving green light to green energy?
Yes, I think few would question that. And most countries are doing that quite at scale. I'm not a specialist in the Canadian energy sector. I know there's a lot of hydro, but Canada should be a renewable energy superpower. It's hard to think that Europe has more renewable energy resources than Canada, but the scale of investment in renewable energies in Europe far outstrips. In the UK, in China, in India, all of these countries far outstrips the investment in Canada.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Madame Chatel now.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It is very interesting indeed, especially these most recent comments. We could be leaders, world leaders with regards to clean energies, apparently. Mr. Usher, Mr. Miller.
For your good work at the UN, at the OECD on this important study of finance, green finance and transition finance. Canadian companies are facing a growing competition for sustainable investment, and we need a robust climate information architecture in Canada. They should be based on data, disclosure, taxonomy. And what we learned, and especially the last panel said exactly that holding on taxonomy is holding on investment opportunities. And I note you mentioned that, Mr. Usher, we already 2 years behind Europe on that. You did mention in your introduction that we have taken some initiative. The OSFI B15 climate risk guidance is good. The CSSB aligning with the standard of the ISSB is a good thing, but it's not enough. And we should go further. Now, you mentioned that we risk being left behind in terms of capital attractivity in Canada. When is our last call to take effective action on disclosure and on taxonomy, Mr. Usher?
That's a challenging question. I think each last call means that there's less of the pie left for the economy, I think, to capture. I think what is clear is there is quite a large global universe looking to invest in this transition. And I think if Canada can put the systems in place and the transparency, it's more likely to attract those investors. And let me quote Larry Fink. He's the world's largest investor, the head of BlackRock. And if you read his annual letter this year, he's not preaching. He's not doing climate advocacy. His view is the world is changing. The energy transition is underway, and they're going to be a winner for their shareholders in delivering on that transition. And I think a lot of what we see from American investors and banks, they're global organizations, and even in specific jurisdictions, the signals might not be there, but globally they see that the trend is happening. And so I think it's for the Canadian economy to get the systems in place, it will attract investment.
Thank you very much. I'm turning now to Mr. Miller. First, welcome and congratulations on the OECD guidance on transition finance. I know you have been a key contributor to this work, and I must say it's very important for a country like Canada based on oil and gas. It's an energy and natural resources. It provides us the opportunity to contribute to or to attract investment in the transition area. But my question relates to your work on another very interesting area is your work on the dependence of the financial system on services provided by biodiversity and natural capital. How can the OECD help our government to technically assess nature-related financial risks?
Thank you very much for your question. On this front, yes. Biodiversity and nature-related financial risk are more nature.
Excuse me, I must interrupt. The sound quality is not good enough, unfortunately, for for you to continue, Mr. Miller. What we're going to have to go to, I guess, Mr. Usher. In the meantime, I know that the technical team here is trying to reach you by phone. So perhaps,
yes, sorry.
So perhaps you could maybe they could try and solve the problem with you. But, Madame,
could we get that answer in writing, possibly?
Yes, that's a good idea. If we could get the answer in writing, that would be very very helpful. Madame Châtel, je ne sais pas si vous voulez, si c'est une question qui.
I don't know, Ms. Châtel, if that question would be relevant to Mr. Usher.
Is also looking at how to factor in the transition finance and the green finance this issue of biodiversity risk and or loss of biodiversity risk and natural capital as well. So, Mr. Usher.
Yeah, absolutely. And I congratulate to Canada as being the host of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed last year. And one of the actions or several of the elements of that framework require or involve actions from the private sector. And part of it is around disclosure. And in the meantime, we have a new framework for nature finance-related nature disclosures, and a framework has been launched this year. And we do have 300 global companies are doing their first issuance this year. I'm not sure how many are Canadian, but the systems are building for companies to be able to be disclosing transparently on nature-related risks. It's not as developed as climate. It's more complicated than carbon, but quite a bit of progress is being made.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Usher, for Canadians who are listening to us today, can you explain how important it is, the transition finance for a country like Canada?
Yeah, it's very important. And to follow on from Hugh's comments, transition planning and having understanding the notion of transition finance, and this is where we need definitional work, and including a taxonomy is quite critical, particularly for resource-intensive economies like Canada's. It's not so much about what is green; it's what is greening. And part of the understanding is many actors in the economy, including those who are quite carbon intensive today, have to be part of the solution, have to drive the carbon out of the system within their business models. To do that, they need transition finance. Okay. And so a critical part of the taxonomy will be defining essentially what is transitioning.
Merci. Madame Posé.
Ms. Posé, thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Usher, I'd like to ask you a question. When you appeared at the Senate around May 9th, you talked about strengthening transparency in order to understand where the risks are related to disclosure. Disclosure that is required is the starting point for all corporate banks, investors, in order to better understand their exposure to risks and what these risks are. So if there is no comparable methodology between jurisdictions, then Canadian banks are exposing themselves to risks. In Europe, the directive on sustainability applicable to 100,000 Canadian companies, including Bay Street banks, will be implemented shortly. Can you tell us more about the impact of the banking sector, of these on the Canadian banking sector?
If Canada does not put its own system is in place, it's going to be driven by the European system anyway, because for large companies who have activities in Europe, they are required to report in English, it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And essentially, the Europeans are defining how they will report. If Canada comes in with an interoperable form of reporting, it allows the Canadian companies to get ready to do it, and essentially it'll work more efficiently. But we are getting, as I think was mentioned earlier, the carbon border adjustment, which is more an issue between countries about pricing economic activities. This is also being applied to corporates through this type of regulation. So once again, it calls out for the need for countries to work together in coming up with interoperable systems. And as you would know, corporates, the thing they hate most is to operate in multiple jurisdictions that have multiple reporting frameworks. That's why the work of the ISSB is so important. That's why CSSB aligning with ISSB is so critical. But that's only part of the puzzle.
Exact, tout à fait. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous brosser rapidement?
Could you perhaps tell us what are the best policies that have been implemented with regards to sustainable financing and the regulations worldwide?
I think this is a global trend. I mentioned 700 and more that have been regulations that have been established in the financial system. We do have central bank mandates vary. Some central banks have a very explicit sustainability as part of their mandate, and some do not. Canada does not. Some have an implicit mandate. Example of banks that have a mandate is actually Bank of England has an explicit mandate, and a number of others. So within the central banks and supervisors, you have some of them who do have regulatory setups that allow them to directly address these issues. I think in terms of taxonomy, as I mentioned, the Europeans are most advanced, but there are many taxonomies around the world that are developing. We're currently supporting the Brazilian government, many countries actually, and part of the effort is to make them interoperable. The European one starts because companies are already reporting. You can start to see how that transparency allows visibility on an economy in transition.
Monsieur le Président, il me reste combien de temps?
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair? About 2 minutes. So we have 2 minutes, Mr. Usher. I have another question. You just talked about taxonomy, what's been happening in Brazil. I think that there are a lot of lobbying amongst advisory boards from fossil fuel companies. If the taxonomies are determined by stakeholders who continue to emit, how will we? Have you seen this happen elsewhere? Companies who emit and who want to participate in determining what the taxonomy should be.
I'm not sure I understood, but let me try to answer it. I think one of the things that's paramount is that the private sector needs to sense an inevitability of the direction of government. And I mentioned the Japanese example. When they see how the world is going, they will invest in helping realize that world. And I think that we're in the economies that are most successful today, the signals line up. I think the challenge in some economies is you get confusing signals. And then investors do not want to invest because the 20 or 30-year investment might not actually be allowed to operate. And so this can be applied both for high fossil assets and low energy, low carbon assets. I think that what's needed is the sense of inevitability about the transition, and the responsibility for that starts with government, but then of course involves corporates and the private sector.
15 secondes.
15 seconds, Madame Posey. You just have the time for an observation. Therefore, you are probably familiar with S243, which is being studied at the Senate. Do you support the project, yes or no? Yes.
Adequacy, we have questions over, but other elements we do.
Excellent, excellent. Madame Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And maybe just to follow up on that, can you talk a little bit about the areas that you support in that bill and what strengths you see?
I think the notion widely is that we need to start to understand how we align with a societal objective, essentially, of the net zero transition. And I think elements of that proposed bill bring in more of the pieces that are required. A taxonomy and disclosure is a step, but there need to be responsibilities also within the corporation around governance, around expectation around transition planning, and essentially every company needs to be expected to put forward what they believe they're going to do as part of these changes which are underway. I think that the bill covers more elements, so it is a step forward. But as I mentioned, there are some concerns around capital weighting and adequacy, which we believe are not yet. There's not enough evidence yet maybe to put that into legislation.
And I'm curious, Canada's considering the role of natural gas in the taxonomy, and there are a number of organizations, experts who have raised concerns about including natural gas as transition or, sustainable under the taxonomy. Do you have concerns with including fossil fuels in the taxonomy?
It all depends on context. What is the natural gas replacing? And are there guardrails around that? Because I think for the coming years, there's an expectation that fossil fuels are required. But in 30 years from now, are they still required? And therefore, if you can put guardrails on investment out for how long an investment is expected to operate, potentially natural gas needs to be part of that transition. But every country will be different, and it's up to every country to figure out how to make that transition.
And if other countries exclude natural gas, is it in Canada's benefit to align more closely with, say, European Union countries who might be headed down that route?
A lot of it depends on what becomes a standard. And I'm not sure I can clearly answer the question. It really depends. If gas is replacing coal, that's probably a good thing. But if 30 years from now, gas shouldn't be operating because, wind can ease lower cost, then the question is, why are you putting the gas on the grid in a way that requires 30 years to pay it back? Maybe you only need 10 years. These types of discussions are what have come up in Europe because of the Ukraine war. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, some gas has been brought in, but most of the investment has been in renewables because at the end of the day, economics has played out, and wind and solar are the major sources of new capacity on the continent, even if certainly there has been some gas additions.
Yeah, and it seems like a kind of leapfrogging, and if we have the opportunity to invest in renewables that will be long-lasting, that seems like both a more climate-friendly but also a potentially long-term financially sustainable option. You talked a little bit about the progress in global standards and regional practices for climate-related disclosures. I'm just wondering if you could give us some more details about the recent progress that's happened.
Maybe I can talk about China a little bit, because I often hear China put up as the problem. I think the problem in China is they're a green superpower, and that should be a concern. And let me give you an order of magnitude. Canada built 2.3 gigawatts of new wind and solar last year. 2.3 gigawatts, it's about one nuclear reactor, smallish one. China built 300 gigawatts of wind and solar last year. China passed 50% of their new automobiles are new electric vehicles. China is moving very fast, and I think the question for the Canadian economy is how to keep up and compete with that change. Rather, their coal use is going down. It's not what has been purported. They're down to 40% of the electricity system today. The real challenge with China is how you compete with them, which is something that most companies have been dealing with for a long time. It's not an environmental question, it's a competitiveness one.
You have talked in the past about the good progress being made by the private sector, and it's not necessarily understood or reflected by governments, but that the private sector can't do it on their own. They need enabling frameworks and sound policies. Can you talk a bit more about how policymakers, regulators are or are not facilitating this integration, and how we can better support the transition to the sustainable economy?
I think, you hear a lot about the IRA in the U.S. and how it's mobilized a lot of investment, and I think it has. It's been successful as an incentive. In Europe, it's more a whole-of-government approach. I think the difference is that in Europe, every corporate is realizing that they have to transition. In the U.S., it's only part of the economy, the green part, that's growing, but the rest of the economy has a lot of uncertainty. And so I think, as you say, the best examples we're seeing is where you combine incentives in new technology with transparency and markets investing across the whole economy and incentivized to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, could you tell us a bit about the weather there in Paris where you are? I'm asking because I'm trying to test the sound.
Yes, of course. Sorry. It's quite dark now because it's quarter to midnight, but it was a very nice and sunny, warm day in Paris, and with a small amount of showers, but being a Brit,
we're really happy to hear that, because unfortunately the sound quality still isn't sufficient. But again, we'll expect a written response to one of the questions, and thank you again. We'll go now to our second round, which is a four. Oui.
J'aimerais mentionner que
I'd like to mention something. All of the questions that we've asked to Mr. Usher, who is working for two organizations, but somewhat the same ones, are also good for Mr. Miller, because they do both work for different organizations that are all the questions go for both of you. So, Mr. Miller, if you can answer some of the questions in writing, if you do have some opinions you'd like to share, that'd be great. Mr. Miller, who is not participating, can add comments or answers to provide to some questions. He can do so by writing.
We can't exchange verbally. If there's anything you want to add in writing based on questions to Mr. Usher, or any thought based on any thought that you think is valuable to the committee, please send it in. Merci. Alors, on poursuit maintenant avec le deuxième tour.
We'll continue with the second round, which is 4 minutes and 2 minutes, respectively, so that we can end on time. Mr. Cram.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Okay, so I guess my questions will be for Mr. Usher, and I look forward to Mr. Miller's submissions in writing, assuming the chair doesn't approve a field trip to Paris in the near future. So, Mr. Usher, I wasn't quite clear from your opening statement. Like, what specific, particular, tangible public policy asks of the government of Canada are you looking for?
Taxonomy, and the next one would be an expectation around transition planning. And Hugh had mentioned that the UK Transition Task Force is considered sort of best practice. Those would be the two steps: an expectation that companies start to disclose based on a commonly agreed Canadian relevant, but also interoperability in terms of with other taxonomies, Europe, etc., to provide clarity, and then the expectation around providing a plan for how the company expects to deal with the changing climate.
And what does the taxonomy piece look like from your perspective?
Well, if we talk about the European one, and many have followed that, there are for each economic sector, there are limits set on essentially you have to emit below so many tons per whatever the measurable is per that sector, let's say per kilowatt hour, to be considered sustainable. But you have to do it with no significant harm. So essentially, you have to show as well that you are not creating environmental or social harms in other areas. So it's not to say we run after something which is really green, but also creates damages in another way. So that's basically the structure of the Europeans and most others as they follow. But then once again, it has to be specific to the local economic context. And as we said earlier, defining what is transitioning is a critical role for the Canadian taxonomy.
So what happens if a company is not considered sustainable?
Well, at this point, it's free, open markets. And so nothing. It's up to the markets to decide. But if the markets start to believe that with the proper with the proper information, they understand that an industry is ready for disruption, they make decisions on that. And, the best example I would have is the Tesla effect. What happened to the value of automotive companies globally when one electric vehicle company all of a sudden became what most investors believed was the future of that industry. And every industry is going to go through or is already going through the Tesla effect of that sort.
Okay, so it's not considered sustainable in terms of environmental terms. It's considered sustainable in terms of economic terms. Is that correct?
Yes, and I think, as we think of environmental issues in a financially relevant way, it's basically, if you are polluting to the environment, the expectation, an investor will say, well, eventually that's going to be priced, that's going to be made illegal, your business is going to be outmoded. And so you need to properly monitor the impacts that you have, including on the environment, and how they will come back and affect you in a financial way.
Okay, so in terms of being made illegal, so that's something I hadn't heard before. So it's a way to anticipate like the next industry that the government will make illegal, and therefore investors should not be investing in this company if it's going to be made illegal before the investment is recouped? Is that
just say yes or no, Mr. Usher, please, because we're really running out of time.
Yeah.
Yes, I think
differentiation between physical risks, transition risks. What I'm talking about, transition risks, which is policy change, which is technological change, and which is consumer change. And any of those can lead to a devaluation of a business model.
Mr. Turnbull.
Thanks to both the witnesses, and sorry that one of them isn't able to participate fully, but Mr. Usher, good to see you, and thanks for being here. Thanks for all the work that you do globally, which is essential. I note that numerous speakers that I've heard speak about sustainable finance have said the strongest economies of the future will be the greenest economies. I think Canada is positioned to be a sort of superpower in leading the energy transition and greening our financial system is part of that. I would ask you, I think Canada is ready because we have legislative and regulatory pieces we've put in place, the Net Zero Accountability Act, carbon pricing, an oil and gas cap, clean electricity regulations, and others. We have investment tax credits, which are rolling out, and we have blended finance, which we've embraced. What we do not yet have is mandatory climate-related disclosures or a taxonomy in place. Can you speak to how important it is to create the right enabling conditions that those two pieces be put in place? You've mentioned them, but what's really at stake?
I think to my earlier comment, it's about creating the sense of inevitability that this transition is underway and is going to be, backed, supported by government, and that's what investors will invest against. And so, as you mentioned, you have world-leading carbon pricing. You have leaders, economic leaders in many areas. Mining, critical minerals is a key new industry that has to develop. So you have a lot of the resources, but the problem, what you lack is the transparency for investors, particularly international investors, to come in and see that this transition is underway and that it makes sense financially to invest in that transition. Other markets are ahead in that way.
And maybe I'm going to share my time with my colleague, Mr. Vancouverton, but I just wanted to ask you a quick follow-up, which was just in other jurisdictions around the world where they have put in place mandatory disclosure and taxonomy, are they able to compete better from your perspective? Maybe just a quick answer on that one.
Yeah, let's take the UK. Energy system, 2.3% relies on fossil fuels today. Largest source of power last year, wind. It bypassed gas. UK, the economy is similar in some ways. It has a high fossil fuel sector in terms of gas, but yet they are outperforming on a case-by-case basis, I think, with the Canadian economy.
Okay, thanks. Over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Mr. Usher. I have a really brief question. Are capital divestments in highly carbon-intensive and polluting sectors, when coupled with reallocations of those funds in innovative, green, sustainable companies, effective tools for lowering emissions?
I think the question is, we know the fossil fuel sector, price of oil is high, so they're very profitable today. And the question is, how are they reinvesting those profits? And only some companies, the ideal we would like to see is that they invest with their expertise in the transition. They have a lot of capacity to do that. We're not seeing as much of that as we would like. I guess that would be my
Can I intervene?
answer.
Like, what about when pension funds and large capital investment organizations divest?
So that's the divestment you're referring to. I think I would agree with other views that divestment as a vehicle it sends a signal, but in liquid capital markets, every divestor normally finds an investor. And so it makes more sense, at least initially, for an investor to engage with the company, engage with the governance, put directors on that they believe are going to be responsible to manage the company forward, and only as a last resort consider divesting from the company.
Thank you very much. Madame Posey.
Oui, alors, merci. Donc, Monsieur Usher.
Thank you. Mr. Usher. Here's one of the problems we have. Organizations are often taken over by private interests that want to dictate the rules for their own benefit. In other countries, is there anything put in place that makes sure that boards of directors and those who make investment decisions are not disproportionately composed of former leaders of fossil fuel industries?
Which expectations being set from some asset owners and others to basically expect that companies do not lobby against certain developments. It is definitely a concern. I think in terms of the governance of the Canadian oil and gas industry, I don't have too much to comment. I think companies need to be responsibly run, and investors in companies need to ensure that they have the boards and the oversight that will allow them to operate. And I think it's up to stakeholders to decide whether the investors are doing the right job in steering the companies they own, including in the oil and gas sector.
Donc, d'après vous, rapidement.
So, in your opinion, who do you think should be around the table?
I mean, coming back to your comments in terms of the bills under consideration, putting expectations on governance in terms of the role and the experience of boards, certainly I think there is some role in regulatory oversight of that. And there are a range of issues that are already expected of directors. There are liabilities on directors. This is an area of concern, for directors if they don't perform responsibly their functions.
Okay.
So I think that's an area where, yes, it does require further development responding to this issue.
Ms. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wondering, you had mentioned China. Are there other countries that you would want to highlight, either that we can learn lessons from that we should be watching, or lessons of folks who are doing it right or doing it wrong?
This is a very dynamic space. Australia, it's a resource-intensive economy, has very large coal, and yet they have had a renewable energy revolution in just the last couple of years, partially driven by a very well-run pensions industry, so a lot of domestic investment, but also securing outside investment. And actually, Australian banks are global investors in the renewable energy industry. So that would be one example. But you can also go to Brazil, South Africa, Japan, which I mentioned, and Northern Europe and other parts of Europe, France. So there are many examples. And I think that's, in a global economy, this is not a trend that is situated in any one jurisdiction.
Thanks so much. I had a few questions for Mr. Miller, and I just maybe will say them in case you have time or interest in following up in writing. One of them was, I know the OECD has been working on biodiversity finance for over a decade, and in particular, incentives for conservation and the sustainable use of biodiversity. Recently, a government think tank published a report on biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, that these are, the second most likely future threat to Canada and the world in the coming years. So if you could write to committee and talk a little bit about how efforts by Canada's financial institutions to address biodiversity loss connect to efforts to address the climate crisis and climate change, how these are overlapping and intersecting. And then also...
No, we're done. Sorry, we're done. Mr. Cram.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. Usher, I wonder if we could revisit the taxonomy and the logistics from the company's perspective. So how, if you have one factory that makes gas guzzling SUVs and another factory that makes bicycles, another factory that makes something else, how does each company go about getting its particular classification in the taxonomy system?
Well, it's a breakdown of based on industry classifications. NACE is one of there are some different classification systems, and the taxonomy has to choose which one they use, but they exist. And then essentially there is a threshold for each economic activity of what is considered sustainable. Most taxonomies have started with climate mitigation, but some of them are expanding to some other areas. And so it takes the bicycle manufacturer to go in and look at their activity and to say, are bicycles considered sustainable? They will be, I think, in most instances. An auto manufacturer will go in and say, okay, I need to sell autos below a certain percentage of carbon per mile driven to be considered sustainable. They probably have a mix of vehicles, and essentially they have to consider how are they going to apply to the system, to the taxonomy based on the mix that they have. But they have the expectation, if they want to secure investment, to say we probably need to transition our fleet over time to get into what's considered the sustainable form of automotive transport.
Okay, and so the companies have to approach the Bank of Canada to become classified, or the Bank of Canada is going to have inspectors with clipboards to come out to all these companies? How does that work?
But these companies already report, and so essentially, as part of their disclosures, they will be expected, and this is what's happening in Europe, and this is what's coming to Canadian companies that operate in Europe, that they do various disclosures as part of being in the financial markets, and this will add. There is a cost associated with such disclosures. It depends on the type of company, but it's true that there are activities involved in being able to do this. But essentially, I'm sorry if I can't give more detail of that's a rough description.
Do you have a high-level estimate of the costs associated with these disclosures?
No, I mean, companies already know how much they spend on disclosures, and there's a whole audit industry built up around financial audit. And so it's going to depend significantly on the type of company. And one of the requirements is, and someone mentioned, that SMEs are an important part of the Canadian economy. You typically have to think about, if you have initial legislation, probably you don't go for the SMEs to start with. You go with large companies who are more capable of doing this work. But over time, large companies source much of their product from small companies. And if they are expected to do Scope 3 disclosures, which is essentially carbon in the value chain, eventually they need to source that information from including SMEs. So it is a whole of a economy approach. But disclosures are something that the whole economy already does. This is adding in one more objective.
And this is for every company in the country?
Yes, sir. A brief answer, please, Mr. Usher.
Well, in Europe, when it started, it was 277 large companies, but now it's growing. It's the larger companies to start with, but that includes now 1,100 Canadian companies are going to have to be reporting to Europe because they operate there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Mr. Vancouverden.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to also try to share my time. Could you kind of signal when I've got a minute and a half left or something?
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to follow on that. What I've just heard is that Canadian companies who are operating in Europe are subject to disclosures and that sort of thing. And when they're operating here in Canada, I presume a lot of them probably do business in both places. They have different reporting requirements. That must be frustrating and annoying. So what would there be to lose? Like, why wouldn't Canada simply adopt the European Union's taxonomy for reporting on these things and then kind of incorporate some of our own assurances and priorities with respect to transition, given that we're a resource economy?
Quick answer, yes. Exactly what you've described, I think, would be the most logical and most efficient for the private sector way of doing it.
Okay, over to you, Ryan. Sorry.
Well, I note that I think there's 40 companies approximately in Canada that contribute roughly 90% of the emissions, and they're the ones, 40 of them that are listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange. And so in the UK, I note that they phased in disclosures, and I think it's the same in the EU over a number of years. Mr. Usher, could you maybe speak, about maybe carving out SMEs and what the rationale for that would be, and then how other jurisdictions have phased in disclosure to ensure that companies have some runway in order to adapt to new disclosure requirements?
Yeah, I think the general approach is you start with large companies and the emphasis on Scope 1 and 2, which is essentially what companies can directly measure, but with an expectation that because most of the emissions usually is Scope 3, let's say for an auto manufacturer, it's mostly people who use their cars that create emissions. It's not the building of the cars. So the expectation that they have a longer, several years on-ramp to get to Scope 3, at which time they need to understand the emissions that are embedded within their value chains. This is the approach that has been taken in Europe, I believe in the UK, and it seems to be the logical one. Of course, you need to be helping the parts of the economy to be able to get ready for these new regulations, and we need to support industries like audit industries who are able to come in and help companies to understand how they can disclose effectively.
Thank you. Could you also speak to the difference between just disclosures and transition plans? Because I think that there's a significant difference there, and you had mentioned taxonomy and transition planning as the response to another MP from the Conservative bench there. And I wanted to just clarify, you talked about disclosures and sort of mixed in transition plans, which I think are both important, but could you differentiate how transition plans go above and beyond? Thanks.
Yeah, very, very different, because disclosure doesn't require you to do anything. It just requires you to be transparent about your current business. It can also, as in the UK, be transparent on your CapEx, so how you're investing, which gives you some view on the future. But a transition plan is the expectation about how you plan to transition to a future state. And so it's a more explicit business plan for change.
once again, it doesn't require you to say that you're going net zero, but the expectation is that they want you to be more explicit to say, well, what are the implications if you aren't going to decarbonize? How do you believe that your business is going to be affected? Like an auto company, if you stay with only oil and gas, internal combustion engine vehicles, do you believe 5-10 years from now you're still going to be in business?
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Merci à nos témoins. Merci à M. Miller.
Thank you to our witnesses, and thank you to Mr. Miller for agreeing to submit responses in writing. I hope, Mr. Chair, have a good weekend, and we'll see you Tuesday. I'd just like to ask something about the explanation why Mr. Miller was not tested. He was tested, but it didn't work. Can we ask why the test did not work, but in the meeting we couldn't hear him? The test actually never quite worked. From the beginning, the interpreters had his text, so they chose to read his opening remarks so they didn't have to really listen to him. Have a good weekend.